It'd be great to get a sense of, since the publication of the white paper in March, what steps you've taken as individual sort of regulators to address some of the AI issues within your regulatory remits. And then I guess on top of that, what is your plans for the year ahead?
Thank you very much. So thank you for having me here, and it's great to be with my fellow panelists again. We have seen a lot of each other this year, and for good reason. It's a very exciting topic, and we are all learning and sharing in the development of UK regulation together. I think what we've taken some time to do this year is to understand what AI means in terms of market risks, systemic risks, consumer impacts, and to really reflect on what we stand for as a regulator. And we continue to feel very strongly about an outcome-based, principles-based approach for the FCA. And so that is the approach that we have taken. Some of you may be familiar with in July, we published the Consumer Duty, where we are really asking for firms to think about whatever they do in whatever way they treat customers, that they put good consumer outcomes at the heart of that decision making. And so through the SMCR, through the FCA Principles for Business, and through the Consumer Duty, we feel that we have a robust way to adapt to firms as they look to adopt AI methods within their use cases. We also published a feedback statement in October on the previous AI discussion paper. And there's a few more things still happening yet to come. One is a piece of work on critical third parties, how we think about the role that critical third parties play in the market, as well as a discussion paper and consultation on big tech. So a lot done so far this year and more to come.
Thank you. Will.
Thank you very much. So for those less familiar with the CMA, our job is to make markets work better for people, businesses and the economy. And in a couple of respects, AI is just like any other technology, if you like, or set of market developments, in that, in two respects. First, we need to understand those developments and the effect they might have on markets. And second, competition and consumer law apply to AI just as they do to every other aspect of the way the economy works. But I think we can all appreciate the speed of the developments, the scale of the development, the potential transformative power is a bit different. And so for that reason, we've invested extra effort in understanding this set of developments over the last year in doing an initial review of AI foundation models, where we produced an initial report in September, and we're continuing with further work following up on that. And in doing that, we were trying to understand the market and these developments as they happen, rather than sort of coming along later and trying to work out what had happened. And we did that at three layers. So we thought about the model development layer, we thought about the deployment layer, and we thought about the consumer experience. And across all of those three, really important that competition is effective and that consumers are well looked after. That's so that the real benefits of the technology can be realized, but of course, as you've heard from others, there are risks and challenges as well. And those include, both in the short term, things like false information or AI-enabled fraud or fake reviews, but also over the long term, if we see firms gaining or further entrenching positions of market power and all the problems that can bring. So in the initial piece of work, we tried to avoid either predicting the future or even indeed being too firm about exactly what's going on right now, given the uncertainty. But we thought about some of the more positive scenarios that might emerge and the more negative, and some of the drivers that might push in one direction or another. And then we put forward a set of 7 principles that we thought would help steer the market towards the more positive outcomes and away from the more negative. And we might get a bit more into this later, but they share some common ground with the government's principles, perhaps unsurprisingly, but in a more specific, in a way that's more specific to competition and consumer protection. So ready access to inputs, compute, data, etc. Diversity of business models, both in terms of open and closed models and all the shades of grey between. Choice in terms of ways for firms to deploy those models. Flexibility for both consumers and businesses to be able to switch easily and move their data, take their data with. Fair dealing, so that means no anti-competitive conduct, whether that's in terms of bundling, tying, self-preferencing. Transparency, very important for consumers, and that consumers and businesses actually get the information they need to be able to make the right kinds of choices. And finally, accountability, which spans the various different layers of the chain. So we, as I said, we produced a report in September, working on an update report for the spring, where we'll share further thoughts on market developments, update our sense of how those proposed principles have been received, and dig further into some particular areas around the access to the various inputs, including on issues around semiconductor chips. And I'll just mention a couple of other pieces of, if you like, parallel work which are definitely relevant. One is our cloud market investigation, which kicked off in October, the result of seamless cross-regulator working, and that Ofcom did a market study and then referred that to us for a market investigation. So that's now ongoing. And then also, and I'm sure I'll talk more about this later, but the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill is in the process of going through Parliament, had its second reading in the House of Lords on Tuesday. And that is certainly of relevance here, although it deals with broad cross-economy principles and digital markets more generally, not just AI.
Thank you, Will. John?
Thank you. Well, I guess as Ofcom, the regulator of the communications sectors, our tools are generally tech neutral. We're very much focused on services and use cases rather than specific technologies such as AI, which I think is a good thing. It means that our focus is squarely on consumers and on market outcomes. And in that sense, AI generally and machine learning isn't really a new thing. We've seen that used very much in our sectors and services over the years. For example, back in 2000, we did some work looking at personalized pricing in terms of, yes, more targeted, but are there implications for fairness and the ethics that go along with that? Of course, recently, I guess, and as we've heard with the one-year anniversary of ChatGPT, generative AI has really caught people's imagination. And the consumer behavior is really important in that, I guess, in terms of grasping the benefits of that. Last week, we published a report, our Online Nation report, looking into what people are doing online. And of course, it's Gen Z, the children and teenagers, who are driving the early adoption of these technologies. And that continues to be an important focus of our work. Back in April, we published a note to broadcasters when it comes to things like synthetic media, deepfakes, reminding them that when it comes to broadcast content, the broadcast code still applies. So importance of not causing offense or due accuracy and impartiality of news remains really important, even if some of that is synthetic content. And then I guess looking forwards, the big thing for us is about 6 weeks ago, we had new powers for the Online Safety Act. That's very much at the forefront of our mind. We've published consultations on guidance on codes of practice, yesterday on pornographic services. And as a regime, which I guess was debated in Parliament extensively with some of this technology in mind, my observation would be, yes, if generative AI is used to generate content which is illegal, harmful, then if, for example, that's uploaded and shared on a social media site, that falls within the scope of the regulation. So we're working through how some of those regimes will take that into account. And then finally, of course, we're working closely with our DRCF partners. I'm sure Kate will say a little bit more about the question of things like algorithmic assessment. Really important for us when a lot of our work involves content recommendation algorithms. How are those safe? How does that recommend content which is important for public service media? Those are questions we're very much engaging in.
So thank you. And a good segue to Kate.
Well, Stephen, do you want to go first, and I'll bring up the rear.
Absolutely, really happy to. So I'm from the ICO, the UK's data protection regulator, and this year has been a wild ride for AI. It has been a busy old time. If I think back to last winter, we were putting out our Technology Horizons report saying generative AI going to be a really big thing for us to think about. We were more right on that than perhaps we thought we were going to be. Move forward from winter to spring, and we were already having to put out our first advice to organisations developing or using generative AI on our top tips on the data protection implications, the things they needed to be thinking about to get data protection privacy issues right. We have then followed through in the summer of this year by doing two things. One was kind of recognizing some of the opportunities in this space, and so we launched our innovation advice service, where organizations that have questions for us on how data protection law applies to their novel ideas could come to us and get responses back on our interpretation of the law within 15 working days or fewer. We started to get a real slew of queries around how ChatGPT or other forms of generative AI could be deployed within organizations, and we're really happy to provide that clarity around that. But at the same time, we spun up our program looking at actually where offerings were being brought to market, how compliant they were with data protection law, and starting with some of the biggest players. At that point, we had to issue a bit of a warning to the market around the fact that we were seeing, in some cases, our fears kind of come true about organizations being at risk of, in the rush to seize the commercial opportunity of generative AI, really cutting corners when it came to thinking about some of the data protection issues in play. In the autumn of this year, we announced some of our first regulatory action in relation to generative AI. We issued a preliminary enforcement notice against Snap in respect of their My AI tool, following some concerns that we had about their ability to assess and identify and mitigate some of the privacy risks in that tool, which is highly used by children, for example. I should stress at that point that these were preliminary findings. We've not taken a final view, and that investigation continues. So we've come kind of full cycle. And in terms of kind of where we go next, well, we're about the time of year where we're going to start putting out our next Technology Horizons report and kind of the things that we're going to be tracking next. And for us, we're really starting to think about personalized AI. The ability to develop a form of generative AI, and particularly kind of a large language model that speaks and engages just the way that you do. And so we're really interested in the data protection implications of that. We are also recognizing that there are chunks here because AI has been a big year, but it's not new. Lots of areas where our policy and our regulatory positions are crystal clear, but there are also some areas where we need to provide additional clarity. When can web scraping be used to train large language models? And if that is the case, what sort of safeguards should be in play? As part of that, just to kind of full cycle into kind of DRCF, one of the things that we're really going to have to do over the coming year is work out actually how to strike the balance right. So you've heard Will talk about the importance of access to data, for example. When we're talking about the regulatory position that we take in relation to web scraping, then gosh, it's going to be so important for us to weigh up the privacy and the competition angles of that as we take that position forward. And so we committed a little bit earlier in the year to producing a joint report between ourselves on exactly how our positions are going to align in this space. Which is perhaps a nice segue to DRCF.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. I think, Catherine, you heard quite a lot this morning about the sectoral approach to AI regulation that the white paper takes, and then about the importance of coherence between regulators as they each work in this space. And I think what you've got this afternoon is an example of 4 of the UK's regulators who are each really actively engaged in AI regulation already. 2 of them are cross-economy regulators, so the ICO and the CMA, and then 2 of them are sector-specific regulators, the FCA on financial services and Ofcom on online safety. And given that you've got these various approaches, what you then need is some way of bringing coherence between them. And that's why the body that I lead was established by these 4 regulators, the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, or DRCF, in order to achieve coherence between the regulators, to make sure that there aren't inconsistencies in what they're doing, and also to collaborate where they can do things more effectively together than separately. That body's now been established for 3 years. It's a non-statutory body. It's a creature of the regulators. It's grown quite significantly in that time to take on quite a lot of work, particularly in AI, but also in other areas, horizon scanning, the skills and capabilities work of the regulators, and in quite a few bilateral areas as well. Stephen just mentioned the bilateral work that the ICO and the CMA are doing on generative AI, for example. But for example, Ofcom has got considerable bilateral work also with the ICO on online safety, for example, with the FCA on online financial scams, and so on. And I think what's interesting for this ethics audience is that perhaps originally the DRCF was very much about coherence for the benefit of its members. But what you're increasingly seeing, I hope, is also benefits potentially for businesses, but also for individuals, so in terms of risks and harms. So as regards businesses, collectively, we want to make it easier for them to navigate the regulatory landscape, which is why we're working towards the AI and Digital Hub that John Edwards mentioned in his speech this morning, and happy to talk about that a bit more later on. And also, at the moment, we're now thinking about our work plan for next year. You've just asked what next year brings. And as part of that call for input, we're asking businesses and others, where do you encounter that intersection between regulatory remits? Where do you see friction or find that you're having to do multiple things for multiple regulators? And if you are seeing that, what can the DRCF do about it? So what would you like to see us do? So that's a call for input that's open for people to respond to until the 19th of December. But on the harm side, so I came to the DRCF from the ethics and human rights community. And what has really struck me over the last 6-7 months since I've been here is how much the regulators are each concerned with those harms. And I think, for example, when it was the AI Summit a few weeks ago, there were quite a lot of side events talking about potential risks that come out of AI, but relatively little focus on the work that the UK's independent regulators are already doing in order to mitigate those risks. And whether that's thinking about bias and discrimination, whether that's thinking about privacy issues, which Stephen's just been talking about, whether that's thinking about autonomy, something I have always been concerned about. Really interesting how much work there is on behavioural science across the regulators. And for example, one recent DRCF output in that space was a joint CMA-ICO paper on online choice architecture, which is absolutely getting at those issues. So just to say that I think for the ethics community, looking at what the regulators are doing in this space is a really nice complement, I think, to the work that's been done on ethics in this space over the last few years.
Yeah, brilliant. And maybe, Kate, just to stay with you for a moment on that. I know, as you rightly mentioned, obviously the DRCF in recent years has increasingly had to sort of pivot its focus to some of the issues that arise when it comes to AI. And actually drawing upon a point that Hetan this morning made about the importance of leadership, do you think this is an area that, in terms of AI governance, that actually going forward, the DRCF will need to be kind of expanding its remit and role into, given the complexities of AI?
Well, as regards the DRCF, we have already significantly increased the work that we're doing on AI over the course of this year. So for a long time, we were working on algorithmic audit and assurance, as has been mentioned, and a couple of other things. But over the course of this year, we've done quite a bit together on implementation of the AI white paper, complementing the big pieces that each of the regulators are doing separately and that they've talked about, which is still, of course, the lion's share of the work, but we come together where we have common interests. And we've also been doing joint work together on generative AI in terms of upskilling us all, developing our understanding, thinking about lots of research in this place and engagement with different communities in that space as well. And yes, I think it's possible there'll be more in that space. But what we don't stand for, if this is the other side of your question, is we're not duplicating the central function in the white paper. That's very much something for DCIT, right? So we involve 4 regulators, but there is, of course, a bigger regulatory piece as well. And just to be absolutely clear, unless it's not clear, or in case it's not clear already, we're simply the connective tissue between our 4 regulators. So when I say we're doing these projects, we're coordinating projects which are being led from the 4. we are by no means any kind of super regulator or additional AI or other digital regulator. We simply join together the dots between these four members, and sometimes others on specific projects, on coherence and collaboration.
And Will, maybe if I come to you, Kate touched upon obviously the central function, which we know will be pivotal to the success of the UK's AI white paper and the approach that the UK takes when it comes to governing AI. I guess what are your hopes and your ambitions for the central function when it's set up and it's working and it's running?
Well, I think there's plenty that can and will do and is doing already. We as the CMA, but I think all of us actually, as a general rule, support the principle of having a central coordinating function, but not creating a sort of duplicative layer on top or another statutory function that then sort of risks clashing with each of our respective current arrangements. Well, I think to try and respond to the challenge of the way you were wanting to segue from this panel this morning to this one, as Hetan was saying, in any organisation or set of organisations, you're almost bound to have silos. So the more that both we as DRCF and then the government, across government departments, but then also to help across regulatory bodies, the more that we can all try and create that sort of connective tissue to spot where the gaps might be, help identify the risks, the better, I think. So I think Lizzie also talked about the central risk function,
Yes.
which seems like a positive development. And there was a paper that they produced, I think, just before the summit, which talked about the range of risks from the more existential end of things to some of the more present-day issues that we are all focused on. And I think trying to think about that full range in the round seems like exactly the right sort of thing to do. And then we're awaiting also the next steps on the white paper, which again you were touching on this morning. But I think it's more or less as you would expect, in that there are the 5 government principles. Actually, when we were thinking then about our proposed principles for foundation models, there's a lot of common ground, things like fairness and accountability and transparency. I think we probably all recognise, but we need to think individually and then also collectively about how those might apply more specifically to our individual remits. But again, that goes to the importance of recognising the distinct statutory functions that we each carry out, and then how the central function might help to link those things together.
Yeah, completely agree. And maybe, Yicheng, if I could come to you, we've touched upon there, obviously, these AI principles and the implementation of those. Now, in the room we have a subsection of the digital ethics community that exists in the UK who will have a very much a long-standing, deep-rooted level of expertise when it comes to the implementation of some of these ethical principles into practice. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, I guess, the role that the digital ethics community can play in helping to support you as you take on this role of implementing the AI principles.
Absolutely. I mean, just to echo Will's points, we're very supportive of a principle-based approach. I think because flexibility is really important here. I sometimes worry a little bit that as regulators we're perceived as people with hammers looking for risks and nails all the time. And actually there's a huge part of this where there are significant benefits from innovation that we need to try and foster. But of course within our regimes we want to get on with what we can with the tools that we have. And I think making the very most of the resources that we have widely available, that's a big part of what the DRCF is about. As Kate said, we're partnering with those even beyond the DRCF where that makes sense on specific issues. I guess to Ofcom's particular focus recently on online safety, we've been fortunate in being able to assemble what I think is a world-class team of talent from tech platforms, from civil society, from academia. So we've been able to draw in a lot of expertise, including when it comes to questions of ethics. Notwithstanding that, though, I think some of these challenges are clearly multidisciplinary beyond what we'll have in-house. And so a big part of what we want to do is to use our, I guess, convening power to meet together with others. I mean, one thought in my mind is yesterday we had our annual Making Sense of Media conference. So this is around media literacy, where we have tech platforms, media literacy practitioners, academics, and we're working together in partnership. We have a network of about 460. all focused on the observation that actually in this digital age, it's not just about the regulation of the supply side of platforms, but we have to improve our critical awareness as individuals to be well equipped, to be savvy, to engage wisely with the services and get the most out of that, and ensure that our services are safe.
Thank you. And maybe Jessica, I'd love to get your thoughts from the FCA. How can the digital ethics community that's maybe here in the room help support you as you look to implement those principles?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important that we think about topics like bias, certainly from a cross-functional perspective. I have a data science background myself, but that comes more from credit risk analytics. And if you talk to the medical industry, they have a completely different concept of what bias means. Bias in that case means not getting a treatment that is hyper-personalized to you based on your individual characteristics, whereas potentially from a credit or a pricing perspective, we might see hyper-personalization as biased, as too biased, or a step too far. So I think it's really important that we flush out some of the language that we use, some of the data standards and structures, and how we think about, based on the use case, what does that mean? What is a good outcome in that use case? And so in my role, I do a lot of work on digital transformation, and we often talk about UX or design and good outcomes. And so I think that's why the principle-based approach from the ethics community can help us understand, based on the consumer use or based on the application of this AI in the software that's being utilized, what is a good consumer outcome? What is an ethical consumer outcome in that instance? And that will impact on each of our regimes, I think, in a slightly different way.
Thank you. And now let's go on to the implementation of the white paper, which I know we touched upon a bit in this morning's panel as well. So maybe, Stephen, if I could come to you. As you mentioned already, it's been a really busy year and it's not looking like it's going to slow down anytime soon. So do you feel like you have the right tools and resources, I guess, in-house to be able to effectively carry out the new roles and responsibilities that are being asked of you in the white paper?
Thank you. Look, I mean, I would say, always in this space, if we have more, we can do more. Yeah. But it's kind of inherent in the nature of, particularly, I think, being a regulation, particularly perhaps being a cross-economy regulator, that you always have to make choices. You always have to make sure that you're putting your resources in the place where you can get the biggest bang for your buck, or where you need to have the greatest impact. And so I think actually collectively lots of us are thinking about, well, now is the right time to be putting our resources into AI. Now is the right time to be making sure that at this real inflection point in the development of the market, we're getting the right ethical standards, the right approaches, the right governance kind of designed in its core now, because by getting it right now, actually we'll have a much easier job in future. So I think, collectively we're all leaning in.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. I've got one more question I'd like to ask the panel before then maybe coming to some questions from the audience and online. So again, just have a little bit think about what you'd like to ask this brilliant panel in a moment. But maybe, Kate, if I could just come back to you quickly, just to pick up on a point you mentioned, or a remark you mentioned as part of your last answer. You mentioned, obviously, as part of the AI Safety Summit, that maybe there wasn't a true reflection of some of the work that's already happening or existing in this space at the moment when it comes to effectively kind of governing AI and some of those risks. What do you think we can do to kind of raise greater public awareness and confidence about some of the work that's already happening in this space?
Well, I wasn't commenting on the summit itself so much as the side events and how I think the side events were great in helping to air some of the risks that people see and where there are issues about trust at the moment, to get those out onto the table. But very much as John Edwards and your panel were talking about this morning, trust in AI is absolutely vital if it's to be used and if we're to unlock the benefits of innovation in this space. And I think it's incumbent on companies to show that they are using AI in trustworthy ways, that they're following the principles, ethical principles that are laid down, and regulation that's laid down, as John was talking about this morning. We, as regulators, I think I can speak for everybody in saying that we're very happy to be open, to take part in events like this, to talk to people. And there are different ways to engage with each of us, as John talked about and as Stephen has talked about, to ask for advice from the ICO. or I mentioned our call for input at the moment, and we all appear before parliamentary committees and so on. So very happy to contribute to that kind of openness, which I think is pretty vital if people are to understand the tools for trust in the landscape.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's very, very welcome. So brilliant. A couple of questions. Go for the one here at the front. Sorry, Sue.
I'm coming.
I should have started at the back. If you wouldn't mind just saying who you are and the organisation you're representing.
Catherine, thank you. Antoinette Haig. I chair the Expert Forum on Privacy Enhancing Technologies. Thank you, panel, for coming to speak to us. On the topic of online tracking, cookies, could you give us an idea, please, of what your industry engagement plan looks like to help reshape and reboot this ecosystem into something which is better than the status quo? You know, as we're here talking about digital ethics today. Thank you so much.
So would you like to take that?
That probably feels like it's me first
Yes.
around that one. So look, we announced relatively recently that actually building on the fantastic joint work that we did with the Competition and Markets Authority, looking at harmful design practices, poor online choice architecture that leads to things like consumers giving up more of their personal information than they would intend to or would like to online, that we at the ICO would be writing to some of the most frequented websites about the choice architecture that they use to make sure that that is fair, to make sure that people are given fair choices over whether to be tracked online. Mindful of the fact that fair choice isn't just kind of a nice buzzword. Actually, when people share more of their personal information than they would like to online, harmful effects can occur. People with addictions, for example, so gambling addictions can be tracked and targeted with repeated gambling adverts online that they may not have intended to kind of share that personal information. Women who have suffered miscarriage can be targeted repeatedly with distressing baby adverts online. These are real issues. So we have signalled an intent at the ICO to make sure that where organisations are not offering fair choice, we're expecting them to make change. We'll follow up on that in the new year. But that's far from the only thing that we're doing to help shape the online tracking, online advertising ecosystem towards something that respects people's privacy and their choices online, whilst continuing to be a great, thriving ecosystem. And well, I didn't know if you wanted to talk about some of the work that we've been doing jointly together on the phasing out of third-party cookies.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. And very good question. So Stephen's given quite a sort of broad picture of a lot of activity in this ecosystem more generally, but then we also have specific cases, as I'm sure you know, most notably in this case, the Google Privacy Sandbox case, where we accepted commitments from Google now a year ago or so, because we had expressed concern about the way they were intending to remove third-party cookies from their Chrome browser and the risk that might essentially create an anti-competitive advantage for them at the expense of other players in the system. And that's now getting closer and closer to the sort of crunch point, if you like. And throughout that, we've been trying to do our very best to engage really quite widely with the outside world. And that can be challenging. It's as you know, it's a highly technical topic. We're talking about a range of very specific new APIs that Google's been developing to try and strike this balance between improving privacy but doing so in a way that doesn't harm competition. And so we've been doing, there's been testing going on that Google's been putting out into the market and trying to get market participants to take part in that. We've been producing quarterly updates on it to flag the issues that we've been raising with Google and how we've responded to them. And there are certainly very active players in the ad tech environment out there as well. I think it's an interesting challenge to a broader community such as this, which is how to, and then a challenge for us, how can we connect with the likes of you and try and get a bit of a broader some broader sets of inputs, not just those people who are right into the really in the weeds of that sort of supply chain, and how can we kind of take on board some of those wider perspectives. So do get in touch if you've got thoughts on it.
Excellent, thank you. Right, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Sue, I know you've got one online.
Yeah, I've got one online and then this lady in front of me. So let me do the one online so we're not forgetting people that are posting questions on the line, then the lady here with the microphone. In connection with the work, the ICO and the CMA in relation to web scraping, will the Intellectual Property Office also be engaged in that work, is the quick question. And then to this lady here, and then perhaps the panel could take both.
Excellent.
Hi, thank you very much. It's Lisa Tully-Morrissey. I'm a digital sociologist at And Digital. I'm just really interested in the counter-narrative that's being presented by big tech about how regulation is going to stifle innovation. And I'm really interested in what regulators think of this myth. I mean, we've got regulation in the food industry, in medicine, and we've seen huge amounts of innovation, fintech, huge amounts of innovation coming from there. What's the counter-narrative that regulators put out to kind of go against this myth that big tech keep perpetuating within society, that we shouldn't regulate because it's going to stifle innovation and stifle creativity? Thank you.
Thank you. First question, IPO engagement.
I know I can cover both really quickly. So IPO, yes, we will be talking to them as part of this. Thank you very much. In relation to the second question, from my perspective, I would say trust is the thing in the middle around that. If we don't have consumer trust in AI, then how are we going to unlock the commercial opportunities, the wider social benefits around that? And we're seeing that consumers are saying they have concerns about AI. Between 30 and 40% of people say that they've got concerns about the impacts of AI variously on privacy, on the security of their personal information. They've got worries about automated decisions being taken about them. They've got worries about AI being used in surveillance. If we're going to get people to a point where actually they have trust and they can use it with confidence, then actually regulation is part of the answer.
And I can add to that as well from a firm perspective. So it's not often that you have firms reaching out and saying they want clarity or they want more regulation. In this case, they have been beating down my door, asking me for clarity. Firms want to know, where is it safe to innovate? Where is it okay to adopt AI technologies internally? Because there are a lot of great opportunities, whether those are around efficiencies, maybe some back office functions. There are things that firms want to do. And equally in the innovation space, we've been doing a ton of work to make sure that firms, whether those are fintechs or existing financial firms with new business models, have an opportunity to collaborate with us in our innovation sandboxes, whether that's our reg sandbox or our tech sandbox, our digital sandbox, our synthetic data, so that they can test those innovative propositions and make sure they're safe and they can be regulated effectively. Thank you.
We obviously all like this question. So I wanted to very strongly echo the comment that Lord Clement Jones made earlier on about that regulation can be infrastructure for innovation. So I think probably, I suspect a number of us might agree with that. Done well, I mean, regulation done well, and of course, regulation done badly can indeed cause problems. It could indeed even play into the hands of the biggest firms because they're most able to handle large-scale regulation. Again, regulation done badly. I mean, in a competition sense, so when we think about targeted regulation for competition purposes, which is what the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill is intended to do in the digital market space, it's quite often precisely the presence of market power exercised in an anti-competitive way that can actually hold back innovation itself. So where you have that very sort of vice-like grip on a particular system and you've got lots of other firms relying on that for access to the market, and the holder of that position doesn't like the way that someone else might be wanting to innovate, that's the kind of area where you can have a problem. And I think we've seen concrete examples of that we've pointed to in mobile and in search and elsewhere. And I suppose the difficulty is that sometimes the benefits that you lose from those powerful positions and the lack of innovation is not seen because it's the thing you lose that might happen in 3-5 years that you can't tell hasn't happened.
Thank you.
I guess just a brief build on Will's point. I mean, I think some of us have been doing this for long enough that, hopefully we're not naive that sometimes you get curious when people call for regulation, or incumbents do, that there may be some incentives around erecting barriers to entry. Having said that, I think the answer then for me is the word proportionality, and I'd sort of link that to Will's doing regulation well. In some of our regimes, whether it's online safety or telecom security, there is a classification or tiering system so that there is less regulation on smaller or less risky entities. I think that's quite important. The other bit I have sympathy with, I guess, is we're increasingly working within an international regulatory context. And having some sort of consistency or at least coherence amongst different regulatory regimes will be somewhat more efficient. So that's something that we all put effort into in terms of trying to reduce the friction.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for, but I think that's a brilliant place to stop for today, but obviously a conversation which we will be continuing on into 2024.